But tonight we're so happy to have Dahlia Schweitzer here. Dahlia Schweitzer is a professor at Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, California. She is also the author of Going Viral, Zombies, Viruses, and the End of the World out of Rutgers University Press. We've been looking forward to this event for a very long time, so please welcome Dahlia.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. There are still some seats if you want to actually have a seat. I think they're lean. So you are here today, as you probably know, to find out about the enduring popularity of the LA Private Detective, and also what the future holds for the LA Private Eye. So the first thing I want to just make sure that everybody knows is why we like the private detective. Who is he? What's it all about? So the private detective emerged in an America that was not really a happy place. There was a lot of distrust of government, of corporations. There was sort of this allure around the outsider who was kind of the renegade, who did his own thing, who forged his own path. And so everyone who wasn't that wanted to be that. So the private detective, to quote Dennis Porter, is seen as a folk hero who is free in a world where the great majority recognize themselves to be under some form of bondage. And so basically, if you want to know why the private detective is still popular today, there you go, I'm done. Just kidding. So to kind of establish some fundamental characteristics of the private detective. So it's almost always a he, and we're going to talk about that more in a second. He's very logical. He's got a lot of integrity. This is not someone that you can pay off. He's going to have a detached perspective. You can't seduce him. You can't manipulate him. He's very devoted to the case. He wants to do what's best. He doesn't care about money. Again, you can't pay him off. He has his fee of $25 a day in expenses, and then that's it. He does not have a boss. He reports to no one. He does his own thing. He's very much a loner. He might not be educated. He's probably not like Ivy League, but he has street smarts, and he knows his way around. So that kind of establishes the basics of the LA Private Eye, in case you didn't know what you were in for tonight. So, from Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe to Michael Connelly's Lincoln Lawyer, the figure of the renegade sleuth driving around the winding, crime-ridden streets of Los Angeles has remained a favorite for almost a century. Despite the rapid evolution of society since the 1930s, the conventions of the genre, the characteristics of our hero, and the trappings of Los Angeles have remained fairly consistent. We all know about Los Angeles and the aimless sprawl. We all know about the insular nature of neighborhoods. We don't really like to leave our neighborhoods. Everything feels very far. We're blockaded by traffic. And then, of course, there's the fundamental incomprehensibility of Los Angeles, which would become repeated themes in detective narratives, in film, in books, and in television. This fascination with Los Angeles as a hotbed of crime and corruption, barely concealed by the palm trees and the blonde bombshells, would also be an integral component of the LA Private Eye narrative. Unlike the tales of granny sleuths, like Miss Marple or Jessica Fletcher, where crime is a horrific anomaly to be corrected, solved, and tucked away like a bad dream, in Los Angeles, crime is constant. This is why crimes and criminals are rarely simple in LA detective narratives, because they are the metaphorical equivalent of a loose thread, which when you start to pull it, makes everything unravel. Not only does Los Angeles offer a dizzying range of crime and criminals, but it also was, and still is, a city divided by wealth. As depicted in The Big Sleep, the very rich live up in the hills, up curving driveways, while the very poor live in the sprawling flatlands below. Mansions are opulent, they're very brightly lit, and then you have the cheap bars and the dirty apartments that are very dark and decrepit. The one person who can easily transition from one neighborhood to the next, regardless of race and social class, is our private detective, the new urban cowboy. Viewers and readers need him to guide them through an urban environment that grows more menacing, more overwhelming, and more isolating by the day. They need his eyes and his automobile in order to experience and understand the city. And yes, I said his eyes and his automobile. Women in detective narratives traditionally serve two purposes, either to complicate the detective's mission or to help in the aforementioned mission, as a resource or as an assistant. Therefore, it is paramount for the detective to keep the woman at arm's length, regardless of which role she plays, in order to demonstrate his own self-control, integrity, and independence. So what happens when he is a she? When the detective is a woman, it destabilizes the traditional narrative structure. After all, the detective must be strong to rescue victims, intelligent to solve the mystery, and able to traverse the geography of Los Angeles, both the homes of the rich and the gang-infested streets, unlike the woman, who is most at home, literally and metaphorically, in the kitchen. Having the hero be a woman pushes off-center the male-female, public-private, intellect-emotion, physical strength-weakness dichotomy that is at the heart of almost every detective narrative. The only way to restore order is by demonstrating that she is either, to quote Kathleen Gregory Klein, an incompetent detective or an inadequate woman. However, as inherently problematic as the female private eye can be, it is worth noting that there is one specific manifestation of the female private eye that is marginally less problematic: the girl sleuth. While the female private eye complicates and threatens the traditional hero-victim binary, the girl sleuth can add characteristics like empathy, sensitivity, femininity, while not posing as a threat. Despite the fact that the adult female private eye is forced to be either an incompetent detective or an inadequate woman, the girl sleuth can be both a competent detective, even if she's an amateur, and an adequate girl. For example, iconic detective Nancy Drew balances femininity with bold adventure, glamorous and interesting enough to inspire and entertain, but not so glamorous or interesting that she might cause trouble. Her child status prevents her from appearing too revolutionary for several reasons. Since her father provides financial security, Nancy does not have to worry about paying bills, and as such, her lighthearted escapades offer pure escapism, both for her and for her fans. Sleuthing is a hobby and not an occupation. Nancy's youth also allows her to sidestep the question of why marriage is not a priority. Elderly detectives, such as Marlowe or Fletcher, are similarly immune to this kind of pressure, having moved past the marrying age. Nancy does not yet have to choose between marriage and a career, and as a permanent teenager, it seems she never will. She detects however and whenever she wants, free from the confines of motherhood and marriage. At the same time, it's clear that Nancy is not a typical girl. Mature beyond her years, Nancy rarely needs assistance because she can do everything herself, and she does it better. She is at once a child and an adult. Childlike enough to get away with her transgressions, but adult enough to succeed at them, much as she has characteristics common to both boys and girls. She can act coy and girly on command just as easily as she can scale a fence or search for treasure in a dark and dirty tunnel. She encapsulates the two sides of the masculine-feminine binary, and she gets away with this because she is a child. She can move between realms of gender and age that elude a typical private eye. And it is this ability to move between realms, adult and child, boy and girl, that make Nancy as powerful as she is. Many of the terms by which I describe Nancy Drew also apply to another girl sleuth, Veronica Mars. First in high school, then in college, then a recent law school graduate, Veronica, the title character of the television show created by Rob Thomas, brought the girl sleuth into the 21st century, inspiring books, 3 seasons of a television show, a movie, a web spin-off, and a reboot on Hulu, premiering in just a couple months. The show was well aware of its lineage. In the show's episode, You Think You Know Somebody, Logan tells Veronica that she sucks at this Nancy Drew stuff, even though she doesn't. In the episode, There's Got to Be a Morning After Pill, Keith Mars, Veronica's father, intentionally conceals their identities while working on a case by introducing themselves as Carson Drew and his assistant, Nancy. Of course, Nancy was never Carson's assistant. Like Veronica, Nancy is Carson's daughter. If high school Veronica is the private detective for the 21st century, or at the very least an updated version, it's significant that both critics and viewers generally regard the first season of the show as the best. In that season, and you can see it all the way over there on the left, she's more of a tomboy and quite young, only a junior in high school. Her looks and attitude make it evident that she is not just one of the girls, and this is reinforced by her total lack of concern for what others think about her. In addition to the benefits afforded by her loner status, her age is frequently an ally as well, allowing her to commit such transgressions like sneaking information out of the police station or breaking into the principal's office, and she gets away with these things, whereas a working professional would get penalized. Female detectives seem to be granted liberties when they are either very young or very old. Ironically, before the Hulu reboot was a thing, Kristen Bell told IndieWire that she and creator Rob Thomas want to bring Veronica Mars back as a miniseries. And she said, "We are willing to put the effort in. I mean, if I have to do it as Murder, She Wrote at 80, we're going to do it. It's going to happen." Bell jumps from the one age where female detectives can detect with impunity, childhood, to the next age where they have similar freedom from female responsibilities, skipping the decades in between where her freedom might be curtailed. Also, in the Veronica Mars movie, Vinnie Van Lowe even refers to Veronica as, quote, Neptune's very own Angela Lansbury. As a teenager, unhindered by the sexist expectations that plague older professional female private eyes, Veronica, much like Nancy Drew, successfully solves mysteries, usually on her own, in her fictional hometown of Neptune, a small beachside community an hour or two south of Los Angeles. Unlike Nancy, and more like Marlowe, not all of these mysteries are self-contained or benign. While some of the cases are compact and easily solvable within an episode, more complex mysteries weave their way through entire seasons, as befits a true hard-boiled private eye. Many of the problems that plague Neptune and fill Veronica's time link directly to an endless web of corruption. You can see here one of her friends says, "Man, is there anybody you don't think is corrupt deep down?" And she says, "Yes, you." Another way in which Veronica flexes her Marlowe-like abilities is when she moves back and forth between the two extremes of Neptune, the very rich and the very poor, both of whom are her clients. Or, as she herself says in a voiceover during the pilot episode as the camera pans over Neptune High, "This is my school. If you go here, your parents are either millionaires or your parents worked for millionaires. Neptune, California, a town without a middle class." In her convertible, very appropriate for a private eye, Veronica, like Nancy in her convertible, and Philip Marlowe in his Plymouth, zips all over town, confident in whatever demographic she enters. Interestingly, in the original concept for the show, the main character was male. As he developed the script, however, Rob Thomas decided to change the protagonist's gender because a, quote, noir piece told from a female point of view is more interesting and unique. And I skipped this slide. This is an ad for the reboot, where you can see it says Veronica is drawn into an epic 8-episode mystery that pits the enclave's wealthy elites, who would rather put an end to the month-long bacchanalia, against a working class that relies on the cash influx that comes with being the West Coast's answer to Daytona Beach. So you can see the conflict between the upper class and the working class is still going to be a huge issue. All right, moving on. In the original concept for the show, the main character was a male, and then Rob Thomas decided that it would be interesting to make it a female. Another thing that he does that's interesting is he plays on that gender role ambiguity. And so Veronica occasionally relies on computer expert Cindy Mac McKenzie. And Veronica refers to Mac as Q, and Mac refers to Veronica as Mr. Bond. Q is an abbreviation of quartermaster, and it refers to the head of Q branch or Q division, which is the research and development department that supplies Bond with all of his cool toys. And then another clip is Mac says, "Please respect the business model, Veronica. I do the gadgets, you do the actual espionage." So again, Rob Thomas is subverting gender expectations by making both of these characters female. There's another interesting example in a later episode when Keith, who is urging his daughter to quit detective work, tells her that he wants her to have a future as a highly paid Ivy League executive of some sort who never thinks about private investigation again in her perfect life. A comment that seems remarkably non-gender specific. Similarly, in the episode Like a Virgin, Meg Manning tells Veronica that she's looking for a white horse, and Veronica replies, "Oh, so now I'm your knight in shining armor." Again, gender is neutral, if not overtly masculine. Significantly, as Veronica grows older, her choppy bob from season 1 is replaced in season 3 by flat-ironed hair and bangs, or alternately, by soft romantic waves. Rather than appearing as a punky high schooler, college Veronica frequently looks as if she is on her way to a job interview. Her hair gets longer, softer, fuller, and her makeup gets heavier, and her relationship to detecting becomes increasingly complicated. In season 3, in addition to all the other changes, the LeBaron convertible is replaced with a Saturn SUV, which you can see right there in the bottom right. The older Veronica gets, the more uncomfortable she is at subverting expectation, and specifically with being a private investigator. For example, in the Veronica Mars movie, which came out in 2014, Veronica compares detective work to a weakness, a vice, and a compulsion. And she also specifically compares it to her mother's alcoholism. In the film's opening voiceover, Veronica begins by diminishing her initial pull toward detective work. She explains that she knows how dumb a teenage private eye sounds, but that it's not like she found a decoder ring at the bottom of a cereal box and thought, "Oh, that's fun." Instead, Veronica begins her detective work after her high school best friend is murdered, trying to discover who killed her. Her initial drive comes from grief and a sense of responsibility. She needs to clean up the mess because no one else will do it, not because she's especially talented or because public pressure demands it. Fast forward a decade, and recent law school graduate Veronica is interviewing at a prestigious New York law firm. When they ask her about her detective experience, which they have seen online, she dismisses it and says, "No, I just answered phones and handled my father's travel." The lawyers interviewing press her harder and say, "Hey, we've seen you on LexisNexis, we've seen all these separate articles and briefs, these cases ranging from homicides to dog napping." And Veronica again dismisses her accomplishments, attributing them to compulsive behavior and an addictive personality, possibly connected to being an adrenaline junkie. Much to her surprise, Veronica heads back to Neptune in the movie to help Logan, who has been wrongfully accused of murder. Once again, she feels the pull and sense of responsibility. She emphasizes this compulsion does not come from a place of talent or skill, but from weakness and addiction. And we get this addiction theme over and over again throughout the movie. When she begins helping Logan find the actual killer, she reassures herself that it's just a one-time deal, a farewell tour, if you will, before being forced to acknowledge that a junkie is never satisfied with just one more taste of the good stuff. Once she's convinced herself that she is going back to New York, she is going to leave Neptune, she basks in the self-congratulations and asks herself, do I get a chip for this? Pouring the drink, swishing it, smelling it, leaving the bar without taking a sip? Is this what getting clean feels like? Of course, drugs and Veronica being what they are, she doesn't end up going to New York, and she chooses instead to keep detecting in Neptune. And you even get her at the end of the movie in a voiceover where she's basically resigned herself to her addiction, and she says, "I know all about accepting the things I can't change. If I were wise enough to know the difference between what I can and can't change, would I even be who I am? I've rolled around in the mud for so long, wash me clean, and I don't recognize myself. So how about I just accept the mud and the tendency I have to find myself rolling in it? My name is Veronica, and I am an addict. The movie's stance on detective proclivities is clear. Rather than being acknowledged for her brilliant mind and keen powers of deduction, Veronica's talents are not merely ignored or dismissed, but they are literally equated with a disease, with an unhealthy compulsion. Rather than presenting her return to private investigation as empowering, this decision is depicted as a failure to improve herself. This choice on the part of the team behind the movie is an interesting one. The film could have presented Veronica as returning to her roots, reconnecting with her true self, realizing that conservative adulthood just doesn't work for her and that she needs to forge her own path. However, instead, the film continues to reinforce the difficulties of imagining a female private eye. Despite the fact that the creators of Nancy Drew did not want to encourage revolution, or that Thomas claims he was merely going for a unique point of view by choosing a female, the radical potential of the girl sleuth should not, however, be underestimated. Her very status as girl allows her to pursue sleuthing in ways denied the more adult female private eye, and by pursuing sleuthing, she pursues information, transgresses boundaries, and forms her own narrative. Ironically, the successful girl private eye seems much more attainable than the idea of a Lady Dick. As our lives appear more and more online, as it becomes easier to share and observe, we have all become private eyes. However, this does not negate the need for or the appeal of the professional private eye, despite the consistently flawed depictions that persist. If anything, we can see through Veronica Mars just how the trope can and must evolve, as well as its increasing relevance in a world where we drown in information overload, much of it redundant, useless, or ephemeral. If the pleasure of the detective narrative comes from watching the detective pursue this information, the skill of the private eye has always come from knowing which information to follow and which information to ignore. We need the private eye to make sense of the private, to sift through the white noise, to expose that which is hidden, to make connections we cannot see, to discover what we cannot find on her own. The private eye, after all, demonstrates the power of the individual. In a society where individuality feels increasingly anonymous with no ulterior motive, this idea is something to be praised. And there is something revolutionary about having that person be a woman. Thank you. And now I will take questions, if anyone has questions.
What's your book about?
You'll have to read it.
No, I mean, is it?
Oh.
Is that just writing more as a chapter? Is it?
Yeah. So basically, what the book does is it looks at, first of all, why the city of Los Angeles is so integral to the character of the private detective. So why the LA private eye is so different than the private eye in New York or Chicago or whatever. So I have one chapter that looks at the city of Los Angeles and sort of why the two are so naturally wedded together. Then I have another chapter where I look at the detective and sort of outline the basic characteristics of, who the detective is, which we kind of did very briefly at the beginning of my talk. And then I have a chapter that looks at what happens when the private detective is African American. And then I have a chapter where the private detective is a woman. And then I have the chapter where the private detective is a girl. And I sort of look at what happens to the sort of the archetypes and the themes in those different situations.
Do police women and police detectives count, or is it really strictly?
No, so I look just at the private eye, because the idea is the detective who's the loner who works alone. And what's interesting is there are many examples of female cops, female FBI agents, because it's okay to have a woman working as a team. That's not threatening. That's okay. But the idea of the private detective working on his own is something entirely different. I touch on briefly LA Confidential, because I argue that the different dynamics and the tensions within that police department have a lot of reference to the private eye, sort of the tropes therein. But other than that, just private eyes. Yes?
Veronica is depicted as flawed, addicted, with pathology.
Mm-hmm.
Are male private eyes perfect and idealized, or do they have problems?
Oh, they always have problems. So, for instance, they can never be in a functional relationship. So either they're single or they're divorced, but they definitely don't have a happy home life. So they have to, the picture that the narratives paint is this person who is just not at home anywhere, right? And that's why he's so restless. That's why he's always in his car. So he doesn't have a happy, solid home life. He's often an alcoholic. He's often a smoker, right? He's always got to be this sort of troubled soul, because that's what reinforces his place is sort of on the outside.
In the latest series of Bosch, his daughter is now...
Is that the one that just came out?
Yes.
Okay, I haven't seen that, but I've read the books, so it's okay.
Well, I guess my question is, the daughter is now emerging as a character, as a full-fledged character. And I've seen this in some other series where people's daughters, I mean, in The Americans, for example, the daughter started to be and I'm just curious if you think that's just the sign of the times, that women are now coming into their own, or there's something about having a father who's that kind of personality that you described. But if you have any take on what you think is going on.
Well, I don't know if she's old enough to be a woman. I mean, she's still a girl, right?
She's in college.
She's in college. Oh, interesting. Okay. I might be jaded here, but that might be the Amazon's intention might be to draw in a wider audience. And so maybe they want to draw in, a broader spectrum, and people tend to watch shows that reflect who they are and what their lives are. So that would be my jaded opinion. Because as far as I know, that doesn't happen in the books. I was like, unless there's one I've missed. Yeah.
Where did your interest in the LA private eye start? Was it with like Philip Marlowe and the classics, or did you kind of make
Encyclopedia Brown. When I was a kid, it was Encyclopedia Brown, Nancy Drew, the Hardy Boys, Tom Swift, and then it became Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot and Agatha Christie's Miss Marple. So I always loved mysteries. And then when I moved to Los Angeles is when I sort of was like, I want to seek out, the mysteries that are set here, because it's so cool to see Los Angeles as depicted in these narratives. So that's, I think, when I discovered Michael Connelly and started reading his books. I can't remember when I first read The Big Sleep, but I know that I think you understand something from the inside out when you're teaching it. And so I taught a class on the LA Detective, and then sort of teaching The Big Sleep and having to try to explain that to people gave me a sort of a newfound appreciation for it. Emma.
Do you have anything about the black detective being Walter Mosley? Is it Walter Mosley? I think?
He's the author.
The author,
yeah,
right.
so Easy Rollins.
Easy Rollins,
yeah.
right.
He's basically the only black private eye, so he kind of gets a chapter to himself. But I talk a little bit in that chapter about the real-life detective, Samuel Marlowe, who many people don't know about him, and he was the inspiration for both Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe. And there are letters, there's correspondence between Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and Samuel Marlowe, who was the first real-life African-American private eye in Los Angeles. And he worked for the studios. There's like documentation. There's like a plaque of his private eye office. And what's interesting, I don't know this for a fact, that Philip Marlowe and Dashiell Hammett didn't know that he was African American when they were writing to him until they met. But you can see, so his real life name was Samuel Marlowe, and so you've got Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe.
How do you think that Easy Rollins is different than the typical white, charming, kind of detective that we are all sort of. I mean, he's still pretty charming, but do you see that there's it's sort of
Yep.
interesting.
No, I have a whole
different
chapter on it.
yeah.
Yeah, so he first of all, he's even more of an outsider, right? Although what's interesting, because in Devil in a Blue Dress, he's not even a detective, right? He's out of work, he's trying to find work, and he gets hired because they're looking for a woman who frequents jazz clubs. And so the white detectives can't go to the jazz clubs without sticking out like a sore thumb, so they hire E.Z. Rollins to do that. So part of what's interesting is the fact that he's hired because he can kind of go into this world where they can't. Another thing that's really interesting is, and I don't know what the choice was behind it, but so E.Z. Rollins is very, very sexual. And so unlike Philip Marlowe, who's always like keeping women at arm's length, E.Z. Rollins has this like rotating roster of lovers. But then he's not a violent man. And so he has a sidekick who does the violent stuff for him. So that's kind of a way, so it's interesting because it reaffirms certain stereotypes and it complicates other stereotypes. Also what's interesting is that E.Z. Rollins owns his own house, which the private eye is usually kind of, very rootless. So he owns his own house, but then his house is also his office because he's not an official private detective. So it really complicates the tropes when he becomes African American. Yeah.
I don't know if you did any research in the real life private detective, but I was curious about if there's any data on what the gender breakdown is for.
It's actually interesting because at my last event at Skylight, there was a real life female private eye who happened to be in the audience. And so I had emailed her and she didn't email back, and I invited her to come, but I don't see her here, so I can't speak to that. I just look at media. I use media to understand real life. What's that?
There's one.
Oh yeah, there's one at least. But yeah, no, I mean it's very much a male-dominated field for sure. I just don't know the exact statistics. Yeah.
Do you have anything about Jessica Jones?
I don't talk about Jessica Jones because she's not in LA.
How about Psych and Lucifer? Psych is Santa Barbara, and these are both police consultants. But have you seen Lucifer?
I actually have not.
It's really, really good. I just watched the first 3 years of it.
I heard it's very campy.
It's very violent.
Yeah.
It's very difficult sometimes to watch.
Yeah.
It's just very sick. A lot of really sick.
And is he? But he's not a private detective, is he?
No, the one I watch is humorous. It's a comedy.
Oh, I'm thinking of Luther. I'm sorry.
Oh, I love Luther. Okay, it's very different. I love Luther. Lucifer it's campy, right? Yeah. No, I haven't. I think I've watched like maybe the first 2 episodes. But is he a private detective?
He is, yeah. And he's got
Okay.
a tough relationship with women, and it's
I'll go revisit that.
It's interesting.
I'll revisit that.
But he's the devil. So.
Yeah, no, I knew that. I knew he was a devil. I didn't know he was a private eye.
But how about Psych? Did you consider that show?
I didn't because it wasn't in LA.
It's not. You're right, Santa Barbara.
Yeah. So I think the only.
And it's more like Miss Marple or Jessica.
Yeah. So the only exceptions that I made to LA was so Veronica Mars is set sort of an hour or 2 outside of LA. Like it's not very clear because it's the invented town of Neptune. But the idea is that they're close enough that they can get into LA, but they're not in LA. And I actually asked Rob Thomas why that was. And he said he just didn't think it would be believable if you had a teenage girl marching into a police station in Los Angeles and being like, you guys are doing a bad job, here's how to do it. So he was like, we had to kind of scale it down a little bit. But the proximity is there. And then I talk about V.I. Warshawski, which is set in Chicago, just because first of all, there's so few female private eyes, and that's also a very interesting case study. But other than that, I focus just on LA. Yeah.
Would you say Harry Bosch is typical of your archetype?
He actually is. He's a cop. So I don't talk about him in the book. I just talk about the Lincoln lawyer, Mickey Haller. But Harry Bosch is also kind of like in LA Confidential. He's sort of like that renegade cop who also sort of works on his own and, you know, has troubled relationships with his ex-wife. And so, yes, he totally fits within that.
Is there a continuity with the Wild West? I think you mentioned something.
Yes, so I talk about the private detective as being sort of like the new urban cowboy. Because Los Angeles was very much seen as sort of like the Wild West frontier, and especially like in the early days of Hollywood, where it was all about sort of like, you know, movie stars hanging out with gangsters and the corruption, and it was like sort of LA it was kind of seen as sort of like the last vestige of the Wild West, and you had the ocean as like this kind of ultimate wall, and it's a very different place than the East Coast and sort of like the, you know, the Ivy League colleges and that kind of thing. Like there was sort of this anything goes mystique. And so the private detective was sort of seen as the urban cowboy who's kind of traversing through Los Angeles in his car, rescuing people, fighting the bad guys.
Did you ever look at Sue Grafton's Kinsey Millhone character?
She's not in LA. So I only looked at V.I. Warshawski because the failure of the V.I. Warshawski movie is so interesting, and the way that, because it really demonstrates how problematic it is to make the female private eye. But I did not get into the Sue Grafton books.
So have you ever tried to write a noir or a private detective story?
It's funny because I wrote fiction before I wrote nonfiction, but if you're not making any money from writing, at least the academic stuff sort of helps my career. So the fiction just kind of is on hold. But no, I would love to go back to writing fiction if I could get a literary agent again.
Were they detectives?
They were actually I wrote a lot of romance because oddly I was good at that. But I would really love to write a horror book. Fiction is just, it's blood, sweat, and tears, and then it just sits on your computer. So at least there's an outlet for this stuff. But I would love, if I could afford it, I would love to go back to writing fiction. Yeah.
Maybe I can wait, but could you tell me what's problematic about the female private eye?
You did come late because I broke that down. But basically, the whole binary is that you have the male hero who's like saving the victim, and he thinks rationally, whereas the female thinks emotionally, and the female has to get rescued, and so all these things get really complicated. And so when you have a female private eye, she's either got to be an incompetent detective or she's an inadequate woman. So for instance, with the V.I. Warshawski movie, they are telling you over and over again what a slob she is and how messy her apartment is. And then this does not show up in the book. And then in the movie, she's wondering if she'd be a good mother. And like, does she have what it takes to be a good mom? And so the movie really tries to make her, more of an appropriate woman. But so basically the only time you can have a female private eye where it doesn't get all messy is when she's young or when she's old. Because when she's in the middle, it's sort of like, well, why isn't she getting married? Why isn't she having kids? Why is she running around doing this detecting stuff?
And I find that very interesting because what I was attracted to, especially with California Art World Vision, is the femme fatale.
Yes.
And the intelligent woman who's outside the society boundaries, she always really appealed to me.
Yeah.
She's smart, she gets what she wants.
Yeah.
She's smarter than the men. And so why isn't that translational into
This is what gets, I have a chapter in the book about it, but yeah, this is what gets really fascinating, and it's fascinating that in 2019 it's still a problem. And one of the TV shows I talk about is The Catch, which was only on ABC for 2 seasons, and I feel like I might have been the only person who watched it. But it was a Shonda Rhimes show, so I was like, oh, it's going to do great. And it was beautifully shot, and it's about 2 women who run a private investigation agency, which sounds great, right? But in the first episode, they are hired to look for this con man who is basically stealing money from their clients, right? So you have, that's the initial premise, is you have these two female detectives and they're looking for this con man. And then wouldn't you know it, the con man is engaged to the main character. So not only is she sleeping with the guy who's stealing money from her clients, but he steals money from her too. And then what's crazy is she still loves him. So he sticks around. And then he starts working with her in the private detective agency.
He's like a male
Yeah, except she doesn't keep him at arm's length, which is what every good detective is supposed to do. Yeah.
Like you, I devoured Hardy Boys and Encyclopedia Brown. I read him like I was 13. I really connected with him.
Yes, me too.
Did you come across the three investigators? Alfred Hitchcock presents the three investigators.
No.
Just like the Hardy Boys.
Was it a TV show or a book?
There were books set in LA. But I love those books too.
I've never heard of them.
So, but my question is, the Sam Marlowe?
Yeah, Samuel Marlowe.
That's I'm a big Walter Mosley fan and Easy Rollins.
Yeah.
So, is there anything written, any books written about Sam Marlowe?
I mentioned him in my book, and there's an article, I can't remember if it was the LA Weekly maybe, there's an article that's online that's a pretty good one. There was a woman that I interviewed, I don't think she's here though because I asked her to introduce herself, Louise. So there's a woman who was trying to make a TV show about it, and at one point the CW was going to do it, and then they dropped it. But so there's a woman who was researching all this, and for instance, one of the things that I asked her was, well, was Samuel Marlowe the inspiration for Easy Rollins? And she was like, she can't prove it, but when she went to, I think it was like right after Samuel Marlowe had passed away, and she like went to his house to like pay her respects, as she was walking in, Walter Mosley was walking out.
Because see, I think that's just, it's brilliant, but it's a shame that Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe, no one knows that.
I know, and I have the contact info. I'm in touch with his grandson, who lives in the Bay Area. So I'm hoping that more attention gets paid to him. But yeah, if you can't find the info online, you can email me and I can send you. There's one good article, and then there's this woman Louise who's trying to get the project off the ground. And then his grandson has like the old like payroll stubs from the movie studios, and like his old address book and the plaque, and so he's got some odds and ends. He's, trying to get more attention paid to it. So I'm all for that cause. Yeah.
So you talked about the private eye as having this integrity and they're fighting corruption, but are private eyes always good guys? I mean, what if they just take jobs from shady people because they need the money? Like,
No,
they're always good guys.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
They might not follow the law.
Okay.
Right, but they're always going to do it for a good reason. So that's why they might have an antagonistic relationship with the police department, because they might be a little bit unorthodox, but they're always good guys.
In fiction.
In fiction, yeah. We're not talking about real life here. Any other questions?
Is there you mentioned that they're kind of anti-establishment
Mm-hmm.
and fighting the man in some sense. Do any detectives ever get political? And then I know like Dashwell.
What do you mean by political?
I mean, do they ever try to transform the community or do anything besides just make little dents and then go back to their...
No, because I mean, not that I know of. I'm not going to say no, but not that I know of. Because again, the idea is you can't fix the community, right? Again, it's the thread in the sweater thing, where it's like if you look at, if it's like you look at The Big Sleep, it's like Philip Marlowe kind of fixes things, but it's more like he just kind of puts a Band-Aid on this one wound, and then we're just not looking at this other wound over here.
Were many of the authors accused of being communists? I know.
Ooh, that I don't know about.
If they're kind of anti-establishment.
Right. Well, I don't know if the authors were seen as anti-establishment. I mean, I know that like Raymond Chandler worked for Hollywood, for the movie industry, Double Indemnity. So I don't know if the authors were seen as troublemakers.
I mean, I think Dashiell Hammett made a big statement by not naming names.
Right. Yeah, I'm not as familiar with that. I mean, I know about that whole time period in Joseph McCarthy, but I don't know about the specific detective authors. I wanted to draw all your attention to my friend in the back, Lisa Stromberg, who's a beautiful, brilliant jewelry designer, and she has a special collection that's inspired by LA Noir. And so if this talk has kind of put you in the mood, I encourage you to look at her jewelry. And then somewhere I have flyers. There's a group in LA that does historical tours, and they do a Raymond Chandler tour. Esoteric, yes. And their flyers should be, I don't know if they're on like the front. Have you gone on their tours?
I've done that.
And how was it? It's great. So yeah, I have their flyers. I think they're by the door if you guys want to get them on your way out. And thank you so much.
Isn't Dahlia just wonderful? It's so fascinating, really. It's just really, for those of you who are not familiar with this store, so Los Angeles, particularly Vermont, has been featured a lot, actually, in LA Noir movies and books. So I feel like you're home here. We have copies of her books available at the register. We'd love it if you bought the books first before you get them signed. We'll move all this stuff out of the way, where she can sign as many books as you'd like. And so thank you all very much for coming to the store.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.